We're going to move on now to Elizabeth Chesak, Kristin Zebrowski, and Kara Dansky. They're from WDI USA, so Women's Declaration International USA. They're going to tell us about the recent national convention. And before we hear from them, we're going to play a short video about that convention.
I'm Elizabeth Chesak. I am currently a board member and I serve as president of WDI USA. And joining me today, we'll have former president and WDI USA's legal consultant, Kara Dansky, and our Georgia state contact and chief of staff, Kristin Zebrowski. We had our third annual national convention in Atlanta, Georgia on September 20th through 22nd. And we had about 80 women there. So here's just a fun picture of us at the convention. We all look extremely tired. So I've been reflecting on all that took place that weekend, and would like to share my thoughts as we say farewell to yet another year's amazing convention. What does it look like to amplify the women's liberation movement? We showcased the research and writing of a wide variety of talented and thoughtful women. We talked about protecting women's rights as a Democrat in today's environment, WDI's book, Women's Rights, Gender Wrongs, Building Bridges Between Women, the DSM-5's sexist diagnosis of quote-unquote gender dysphoria, lesbian culture, how the current trans movement uses the playbook of the 1970s left to attack today's feminists, sexism and gender ideology in progressive social movements, the challenges young women in particular face and how they can become involved in the feminist movement, the quote-unquote LGBT movement and transgender ideology, fan fiction, gender nonconformity and femininity, fetal personhood laws as a threat to women's liberation, what women across generations have to learn from each other, and the experiences of desisted and detransitioned women. And this picture is the current board. And this is a picture of us tuning in live to FQT. So this was fun. I love this picture so much. In her closing remarks at our first convention in 2022, Kara Dansky said, quote, "We wanted to light a torch that would turn into a flame that would keep burning until all women and girls are truly liberated," end quote. A few years on, I think it's safe to say that we did. From the initial spark in 2022, reigniting the women's liberation movement, we fanned the flames last year in San Francisco, accelerating the movement. And now this year's theme of amplifying the women's liberation movement has culminated in passing the torch. It's been wonderful to see young women, intergenerational friendships, mothers and daughters, women from other countries, and women determined not to put up walls but to build bridges. I'm equally pleased by the number of women who said that this was their first ever in-person women's gathering. Quite a few of you said you'd only become aware of the power and potential of women's liberation within the last few years. Our message is getting out there, uniting women who might otherwise never have met. I'd like to end with two quotes that I think are particularly relevant to this year's theme of amplifying the women's liberation movement. The first is a passage from Intercourse by Andrea Dworkin. Quote, "In her heart, she is a mourner for those who have not survived. In her soul, she is a warrior for those who are now as she was then. In her life, she is both celebrant and proof of women's capacity and will to survive, to become, to act, to change self and society. And each year she is stronger and there are more of her." End quote. She wrote that almost 40 years ago, but she could be writing about us today. And as Kara often says, if we can be heard, we will win. So I have pictures from my two panels that I was part of. This isn't a panel picture, but this is Fern Lopez and I on the Desisted and Detransitioned Women's Caucus. So Fern and I and another woman named Celine, who was unfortunately not able to attend in person, make up that caucus. So it was lovely to get to meet Fern and to be on that panel with her. And it was just a very proud moment because I got the idea for the caucus shortly before last year's convention. And I just remember being so nervous about, floating the idea of whether we wanted to do this. And so I'm just extremely proud of how far we've come. This is the promo image for the intergenerational panel. So this was my brainchild, and it was facilitated by Kara and then included 5 women across 4 generations. So Gen Z, Millennial, Gen X, and Baby Boomer. And this panel was also just very special to me because when I was in college, one of my programs that I studied was called Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies. They don't really have women's studies anymore, at least not as widely as they used to. And so it's just been so transformative for me to talk to older women, to talk to Gen X and Boomer women and be mentored by them and discuss theory and history and how it applies to our own lives. And I always come away with reading recommendations. So that panel was so much fun. And both of these will be available as recordings on our YouTube channel shortly.
I'm the Chief of Staff of WDI USA, and I've served as the Georgia State contact since November of 2020. As many of you know, our previous conventions took place in the Mid-Atlantic and West Coast regions. So when the survey of potential locations for the 2024 convention went out last November, I eagerly proposed a few Southeastern locations. And I believe that Georgia was an important place to bring WDI's message to, as Georgia is the only state in the Southeast that doesn't yet protect women and girls' sports. However, our Lieutenant Governor has recently vowed to support that cause. By January, I began gathering proposals from venues in Atlanta so that the board could select a perfect site for our convention. I'm thrilled that this vision came to life. With the city of Atlanta selected and the theme of amplifying the women's liberation movement secured, I turned my attention to programming when the request for session proposals went out, focusing on how we could foster unity among women. After consulting with the rest of the Black Women's Caucus about my idea to submit a proposal for a session that addressed the tribalism among women that often holds us back as a collective, a session that explored how women could become more unified politically, socially, legally, I was fortunate to have my fellow caucus members support my intended proposal. I reached out to women whose insights on women's rights I found particularly compelling, especially those whose backgrounds diverged from the radical feminist archetype. I saw this diversity as essential for fostering a rich dialogue. Ultimately, our panel featured an incredible lineup of speakers, starting from the right. There's Denise Traina, a dedicated activist and co-chair of the Georgia Green Party, who emphasizes the importance of respectful dialogue and creating the world we want to live in. Then Mary Elizabeth Castle, the Director of Government Relations for Texas Values, recognized for her advocacy in child protection and commitment to women's rights. Dr. Suzanne Bierling, who I believe is here today, and who most people are familiar with here, a global leader with extensive experience in child welfare and mental health. She brought a wealth of knowledge to our discussion. And on the left side, Alexandra Renee, also known as Pinwheel Art, a passionate motherhood activist who focuses on bridging gaps within the feminist movement. This session, titled Building Bridges to Amplify Women's Liberation, explored common ground among women from diverse backgrounds and with different approaches to women's liberation. We emphasized how embracing a variety of experiences can enrich our movement and foster collaboration for greater impact. During the session, our distinguished panelists shared pivotal moments from their journeys that have shaped their approaches to feminism. They reflected on how their unique backgrounds informed their activism, providing inspiring insights into their social and professional experiences. One of the key topics we explored was the imperative of inclusivity in advancing women's rights, where panelists discuss what inclusivity means to them and why it's crucial for the success of our movement. They shared real-life examples of situations where embracing diversity led to significant positive outcomes, showcasing practical implementations of inclusive practices that we can all learn from. We also delved into strategies for bridging ideological divides among women when working towards preserving women's rights. Our panelists recounted specific instances where they successfully found common ground, leading to unexpected alliances and advancements in their work. Their stories emphasize the importance of collaboration and open dialogue in overcoming differences. Another important aspect of our discussion focused on leveraging diverse skill sets to enhance the effectiveness of feminist activism. The panelists highlighted how various skills have played a crucial role in advancing feminist goals and discussed some skills that are often underrepresented and undervalued in our movement. As panelists shared actionable steps for fostering inclusivity within feminist circles and activist efforts, the panelists addressed common challenges they've encountered and the solutions they've implemented to promote inclusive practices. To conclude the session, each panelist provided a call to action, encouraging participants to take specific steps in their communities to make a tangible impact. As I delivered my closing remarks, the final visual displayed was a poignant tweet from Venice Allen from September 13th. It stated, "The last time I spoke to Magdalene, she asked me to do everything I could to unite women, unite all the women in this fight, and I promised her that I would. It's not always easy to work across the aisle, but infighting is a waste of energy when there is still so much work to do." I hope the insights shared during this session inspire women to take meaningful steps toward that goal and that we engage in thoughtful conversations and actions with other women, both within and beyond our circles. Together, we can build bridges and create a stronger women's liberation movement. This convention was an empowering experience that was also emotionally challenging at times. The common thread across each session was clear. The fight for women's sex-based rights is far from over, and the forces seeking to silence us are as relentless as ever. However, in the spirit of collaboration and unity, it was a privilege to be surrounded by such formidable women. Helping to organize and participating in this gathering of passionate advocates reinforced my belief that together we are stronger. The road ahead may be tough, but with the passion and resilience demonstrated at this convention, I know women will continue to push forward. Through solidarity, we can make significant strides in preserving and advancing women's sex-based rights. I left the convention inspired to carry that spirit of unity forward.
Okay, so my portion of our presentation on the U.S. Chapter's 2024 convention will focus on the panel I facilitated on Friday night called Protecting Women's Sex-Based Rights as a Democrat in Today's Environment. As many audience members know, the U.S. Democrats have been sacrificing women and girls at the altar of so-called gender identity for years. President Biden has been saying that transgender discrimination is the civil rights issue of our time since at least 2012. In 2015, a group of Democrats introduced the so-called Equality Act in both chambers of Congress, and it's been around since that time. If enacted, that bill would redefine sex to include so-called gender identity for literally all purposes under U.S. civil rights law. It would mean the complete annihilation of all female-only sports and spaces. It has passed in the House of Representatives twice, both times under Democratic leadership, but has never reached a floor vote in the Senate. In 2016, President Obama issued a guidance document to schools across the country, instructing them to define sex to include so-called gender identity for all purposes under Title IX, which is meant to protect women and girls as a sex class in the educational arena. And of course, President Biden notoriously issued Executive Order 13988 on his first day of taking office, instructing federal agencies to redefine sex to include so-called gender identity for all purposes under federal regulatory law. As a political party, the Democrats' embrace of so-called gender identity is nearly total. But that doesn't mean there aren't individuals who are pushing back, and I wanted to invite some of them to present their views and experiences during the convention. The panelists were Val Applewhite, who is the second from the left panelist on your screen, Maud Marone, who's on the far left on your screen, although not in reality, and Jenny Poyer Ackerman, who's sitting next to me toward the right. Val Applewhite is a state senator in North Carolina. In 2023, she became one of the first and only Democratic lawmakers at the state level to cast a vote to protect female-only sports. I was delighted when she accepted my invitation to speak. Maud Marone is a mom of 4 who lives in New York City. In 2021, she ran for city council as a Democrat, and the next year she ran for Congress as a Democrat. At some point, she put, quote, "I stand with J.K. Rowling" in her Twitter bio. And of course, everyone here knows what that means. She was not expressing her love of Harry Potter novels. "I stand with J.K. Rowling" is basically a turf bat signal. So I reached out to her, and we've been friends ever since. During her run for Congress, she was excluded from a town hall event to which every other Democratic candidate had been invited. The city's Democratic establishment had decided that she was transphobic and should not be permitted to speak. The city's Democratic elite eventually hounded her out of the party, and these days she's an independent. Jenny Poyer Ackerman is one of the founders of the group Democrats for an Informed Approach to Gender, which goes by the acronym DIAG. This group was formed mainly by parents on the political left whose children are caught up in the cult of trans. Most of the group's leaders remain anonymous because their children are still caught up in it. It's only Jenny who feels she can speak out because her daughter desisted from the cult of gender. Jenny was there to talk about the urgency of rank and file Democrats taking a firm stand against party leadership. Senator Applewhite kicked off the panel by telling the story of what it was like to rebel against her own party by casting a voice vote in support of a Republican-sponsored bill to protect women's sports. When the bill landed on her desk, she considered it thoughtfully. She said she thought about her son, who is himself an athlete who stands at over 6 feet tall. She thought about whether it would be fair for him to compete in women's sports if one day he decided he's a girl. She realized that, of course, it would not be, and made the decision to vote accordingly. On the day of the vote, there she was, on her own in the Senate chamber, the lone Democrat to take a stand. She told us that she received a tremendous amount of support privately, but was publicly vilified. Someone had the gall to call her, and I'm sorry for this language, a transphobic whore. She has stood her ground, though, and I'm happy to say she stayed throughout the entire conference. I'm sure she learned a lot about the gender cult that weekend. Maud told us about her experiences of being a New York City Democrat who vocally supports women's sex-based rights. It hasn't been easy for her. She did eventually win a seat on her local school board. In that capacity, she persuaded a majority of school board members to vote to revisit a 2019 city policy allowing boys to compete in girls' sports and access girls' spaces. Her proposal was very modest. It didn't demand the removal of boys from girls' sports and spaces. It simply called on the city to reevaluate the 2019 policy. Even that was too much for the gender cult, and they have been harassing her ever since. The school chancellor even took the outrageous step of kicking her off her seat, to which she had been duly elected by local parents. I'm happy to report that she successfully sued to be reinstated. Jenny went last and talked about DIAG's work. DIAG's main goal is to empower rank and file Democrats to talk to their elected officials and explain the leftist critique of so-called gender identity to them. For the most part, Democratic elected officials ignore those of us who speak about these things, but DIAG is committed to the idea that our Democratic elected officials cannot ignore all of us forever. And if enough of us keep speaking out, we'll be able to make a difference. There was plenty of time for Q&A, and one questioner pointedly asked the panelists if they were willing to share their thoughts on who they intended to vote for in the November presidential election. I braced myself because I was a bit terrified of what would happen. I knew that Maud was likely to say that she's voting for Trump because she is tired of the Democrats' assaults on women's rights as well as free speech. I knew that Senator Applewhite was likely to say that she's voting for Harris because she finds Trump to be an unacceptable alternative. I knew that Jenny was likely to say that she did not plan to vote for either candidate. At the time, I had forgotten that Jenny has actually expressed an intention to write in my name, which is very flattering. Maud did indeed say that she plans to vote for Trump. Senator Applewhite did indeed say that she plans to vote for Harris. Jenny reiterated her intention to write in my name. The reason I was terrified is that I worried that the conversation would cause rancor among convention participants. I didn't want to kick off the convention by discussing an extremely contentious issue that convention attendees likely had very strong views about. Now, my purpose in sharing all of this today is not to express any view on how or whether any American should vote in November. This election season is the most intense I have ever experienced. Emotions are running high. People have very strong opinions on all of this. My point is simply to say that I was very happy that the panelists handled the matter with perfect decorum. I'm sure Senator Applewhite was shocked to hear that a Democratic woman had changed her party affiliation and planned to vote for Trump. Notwithstanding her 2023 vote to protect women's sports, Senator Applewhite is not as immersed in these matters as many of the rest of us are. Despite everyone's strong views, the panelists were extremely respectful toward one another. And even better, the discussion did not seem to cause a lot of rancor among convention attendees. Everyone seems to understand that this presidential election is absolutely agonizing for many women on the political left who want to protect women's sex-based rights. I'll just conclude by saying that there are countless rank and file Democrats all over the country who are furious at party leadership for sacrificing women and girls at the altar of so-called gender identity. Many of us speak out using their own names, others do so anonymously. Still others don't have large platforms, but they speak with friends and family members. There are plenty of Americans on the political left who feel completely betrayed by our party leaders. My main purpose in hosting the panel was to demonstrate that it is possible to advocate for women's sex-based rights as a Democrat in today's America, if only more people could do so. Okay, now I gave some closing remarks at the end of the convention concerning an upcoming case that I want to address briefly. This case is called Olympus Spa versus Armstrong. Olympus Spa is a female-only spa outside of Seattle. Nudity at the spa is expected and preferred. I have experienced this personally, having been to the spa on a few occasions when I lived in Seattle. So, a man named Caleb, who calls himself a woman named Haven, brought the spa before the State Human Rights Commission, arguing that its female-only policy violates his rights under Washington state law. WDI USA opposes all men in female-only spaces, including those who have had surgery. But it's worth noting that Caleb has not had surgery to remove his genitalia. He won before the State Human Rights Commission. So the spa sued both him and the Human Rights Commission in federal court. The federal district court ruled in favor of him and the Human Rights Commission because Washington state law prohibits discriminating against men on the basis of men's gender identities. In its decision, the federal district court repeatedly and uncritically used the phrase transgender women with male genitalia. The spa appealed to the Federal Court of Appeals, where WDI USA filed a friend of the court brief. Our brief makes the following arguments. First, if the relevant state law elevates gender identity over sex, it violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Second, that Washington state cannot both prohibit discrimination on the basis of gender identity and also enforce its own criminal laws against indecent exposure and voyeurism. And third, the word transgender is a linguistic sleight of hand that obscures the material reality of sex and entrenches regressive sex stereotypes. While I was writing the brief, I found myself feeling infuriated that a United States federal court would use a phrase like transgender women with male genitalia. I realized I was going to have to define the phrase male genitalia to explain why this is such a problem. So I did. I cited a definition of male genitalia from the National Institutes of Health, which was basically a list of male reproductive and sexual organs. The brief then continues, quote, at no point did the district court explain how individuals with male genitalia can be a type of women. It goes without saying that women do not have any of these organs. It is truly a testament to where we are as a society today that it must be said in the context of federal civil rights litigation that women don't have penises. So the Federal Court of Appeals will hear oral arguments in the case next month, and the U.S. chapter fully intends to be at the courthouse to rally in support of women and girls as a sex class. Thanks, that's all I have.